Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most politely dressed disaster in American medical history. A small white rectangular pill that a generation called a bar, and that the pharmaceutical industry called a breakthrough. Here's a fact that should stop you cold. In 2013, American doctors wrote 94 million prescriptions for benzodiazepines. That's one prescription for roughly every 3 adults in the country. Not heroin, not meth cooked in a trailer. A legal, FDA-approved, physician-recommended medication, handed out in waiting rooms that smell like antiseptic and false reassurance. The drug didn't come from a criminal. It came from a man in a white coat with a medical degree on the wall and a pen that never seemed to run out of ink. The paradox is almost too perfect to be real. Xanax was designed to treat anxiety, and it worked. Spectacularly, immediately, and in a way that made every other solution feel slow and inadequate by comparison. The problem was that it worked the way a fire works when you're cold. Incredibly effective, impossible to control, and likely to burn the house down if you looked away for too long. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand what happened to Ryan Calloway, you first need to understand the world he was born into. America in 2013 was not a calm place. The financial crisis of 2008 had torn through the country like a slow-moving chainsaw, and 5 years later, the wound hadn't healed. It had just been bandaged with optimism and cheap credit. Young people in their 20s were working jobs that paid less than their parents had earned at the same age, carrying student debt that felt less like a loan and more like a sentence, living in apartments they split 3 ways because the math didn't work any other way. The economy had recovered on paper. Real life was a different document entirely. Anxiety disorders became the most common mental health condition in the United States during this period, affecting an estimated 40 million adults. That number is so large it loses meaning. So think of it this way. If you were in a room with 2 other people in 2013 America, statistically, one of the 3 of you was struggling with anxiety severe enough to interfere with daily life. The room was full of people pretending to be fine. Into this environment, the pharmaceutical industry brought alprazolam, brand name Xanax, and its molecular cousins, Klonopin, Valium, Ativan, benzodiazepines, a class of drugs that target the GABA receptors in the brain, essentially pushing a neurological mute button on fear, stress, and the grinding, relentless noise of a mind that won't slow down. For someone experiencing genuine anxiety, the first dose could feel like stepping out of a burning building. Relief so complete it was almost violent in its contrast. Doctors prescribed them liberally. The instructions were clear: short-term use only, low doses, careful monitoring. The reality was messier. A 10-minute appointment in an overscheduled clinic doesn't leave room for nuance. A patient describes panic attacks. The physician nods, types, prints. The prescription takes 30 seconds to write. The dependency it creates takes months to build and years to dismantle, if it gets dismantled at all. Ryan Calloway was 24 years old in the spring of 2013, and on the surface, his life looked like the ordinary scramble of a young man trying to get his footing. He'd grown up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where the houses all had 2-car garages and the lawns were mowed on Saturdays, and the general social contract involved not discussing anything too uncomfortable at the dinner table. His parents, Carol and Dennis, were decent people. Not wealthy, not struggling. Middle of the road in the specifically American way that means you have enough to not worry about survival, but not enough to stop worrying entirely. Ryan had been a sharp kid. Teachers remembered him as the type who understood things quickly and got bored even quicker. He had a quality that's hard to name but easy to recognize, a kind of restless intelligence that could have gone in any number of directions. He started college at Ohio State, declared a business major, changed to communications, then psychology, then stopped declaring anything because declaring felt like committing to a future he couldn't see clearly. 2 years in, he dropped out. Not dramatically, he just stopped going, the way you stop going to a gym when the results feel too slow and the effort feels too high. By 2013, he was working at a logistics company in Columbus, scheduling freight, managing spreadsheets, sitting under fluorescent lights for 8 hours a day doing work that required his hands but not his mind. He was good at the job in the mechanical sense. He showed up, he completed tasks, he did not set anything on fire, but the distance between who Ryan felt he was and what his daily life required him to be had been growing steadily for 2 years, and it had the specific texture of anxiety, that low-frequency hum of wrong that you can't locate and can't shut off. His first panic attack happened on a Tuesday morning in March. Not during anything dramatic, not during a crisis or a confrontation. He was sitting at his desk reviewing a shipping manifest when his chest tightened in a way that had no relation to anything happening in the room. His heart accelerated without permission. The air seemed to thin. His hands went cold. He excused himself to the bathroom, sat on the floor of a stall, and spent 15 minutes convinced he was either dying or going insane, unsure which outcome was worse. It wasn't a heart attack. The company's HR coordinator drove him to a walk-in clinic, where a physician spent approximately 12 minutes with him, ruled out cardiac causes, and diagnosed situational anxiety. The prescription was written before Ryan fully understood what he was being prescribed. Alprazolam, 0.5 milligrams, twice daily as needed. The doctor said it would take the edge off. He said to use it only when necessary. He said a lot of things in the tone of someone who had said them many times before and had stopped listening to his own words. Ryan took the first pill in the parking lot of the clinic, sitting in the passenger seat of his co-worker's car, feeling slightly stupid about the whole episode. 40 minutes later, the world changed, not in a hallucinatory way. There were no colours, no visions, no dramatic shift in perception. It was subtler and more seductive than that. The hum simply stopped. The chest tightness dissolved. The sense of impending wrongness that had been living somewhere between his sternum and his throat since approximately 2011, that thing he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing its weight, lifted, gone. The absence of it felt like putting down a bag you'd forgotten you were holding. He went back to work that afternoon and finished the shipping manifest. He felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, completely fine. That sensation, that specific pharmaceutical-grade relief, was not a side effect. It was the intended function. Xanax did exactly what it was designed to do, in exactly the way the manufacturer intended. The tragedy of benzodiazepines is not that they fail. It's that they succeed so thoroughly that the brain begins to reorganize itself around the success. Ryan didn't know that yet. All he knew was that the thing that had been wrong was now fixed, and a small white pill had done the fixing, and it was prescribed by a doctor, which meant it was safe, which meant there was no reason to be careful. He refilled the prescription 3 weeks later. The bottle was supposed to last 30 days. The human brain is, among many other things, an efficiency machine. It identifies what works and doubles down on it. When alprazolam arrives and activates the GABA receptors, the brain's natural braking system, the brain experiences relief so immediate that it begins, slowly and without any conscious instruction, to reduce its own natural production of calming chemicals. Why manufacture something internally when the supply chain is external and reliable? This process is called neuroadaptation. It takes weeks, not months. By the time Ryan had been taking Xanax for 6 weeks, his brain had already begun outsourcing its emotional regulation to a pharmaceutical company. The pills were no longer supplementing his natural calm. They were replacing it. He didn't feel this happening. The change was invisible from the inside. What he noticed instead was that the 0.5 milligram dose that had once worked completely now seemed to work partially. The edge it took off was slightly less sharp. The relief was slightly less total. This is called tolerance. The brain adjusting its receptor sensitivity to account for the new normal. And it happens with benzodiazepines faster than most people, including most prescribing physicians, fully appreciate. Ryan's solution was the obvious one, in the way that most catastrophic decisions are obvious in the moment. He took 1.5 pills instead of 1, then 2. The full relief returned. The hum stayed quiet. He went to work, sat under the fluorescent lights, moved freight numbers around on spreadsheets, and felt, if not happy, then at least functional, which in 2013 Columbus, Ohio passed for the same thing. His prescription ran out 11 days before the end of the month. The doctor's office said they could schedule a follow-up appointment in 3 weeks. The pharmacy said they couldn't refill early without a new prescription. Ryan spent 1 day without the pills and understood viscerally and completely that 3 weeks was not an option. The anxiety that returned without the medication was not the anxiety he'd had before. It was something different, sharper, more physical, accompanied by sweating and a tremor in his hands that he'd never experienced in his life. He called a friend, the way you call a friend when you need something you can't say out loud in a pharmacy. The friend knew a guy. The guy knew prices. The prices were surprisingly reasonable, which is the detail that should have frightened Ryan most but didn't. Because when you're managing withdrawal symptoms in a bathroom at a logistics company in Columbus, Ohio, reasonable prices feel like good news. He bought a week's supply off the street. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself it was just until the appointment. He believed both of those things completely. He was wrong about both of them in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The appointment with the doctor came and went in the way that mattered least. Ryan sat in the examination room, described his symptoms in measured, careful terms. Enough truth to get a refill, not enough to raise a flag. The physician reviewed the chart, asked if the medication was helping, and Ryan said yes, which was accurate. He didn't mention the tolerance. He didn't mention buying pills off the street. He didn't mention that his hands had shaken for 3 days when he ran out. The doctor renewed the prescription, bumped the dosage slightly to 1 milligram twice daily, and reminded Ryan that this was a short-term solution. Ryan nodded. He left with a new bottle and a sense of relief so immediate it started in the parking lot, before he'd even opened the childproof cap. The street supply continued anyway. The prescription covered the baseline. The extra pills covered everything the baseline didn't. By June of 2013, Ryan was taking between 4 and 6 milligrams of alprazolam per day, 3 to 4 times the prescribed dose, combining pharmaceutical pills with street bars of inconsistent quality and unknown origin. He had constructed, entirely without intending to, a chemical architecture around his daily existence. The structure was precise in its own way, even if it looked like chaos from the outside. The word habit is too soft for what benzodiazepine dependency actually is. A habit is something you do reflexively, biting your nails, checking your phone, taking the same route to work. A habit lives in behavior. What Xanax dependency creates is something that lives deeper than behavior. It rewires the brain's baseline chemistry until the concept of normal is redefined at a neurological level. To understand what Ryan was living inside, you have to understand what his brain had become. The GABA system, the network of receptors that benzodiazepines target, functions as the central nervous system's primary inhibitory mechanism. In plain language, it's the brain's natural way of telling itself to calm down. When external alprazolam floods those receptors consistently over weeks, the brain responds with elegant destructive logic. It reduces the number of GABA receptors. It decreases their sensitivity. It quietly, systematically dismantles its own calming infrastructure because the infrastructure appears to have been outsourced. This is called downregulation. It happens without any conscious participation from the person experiencing it. There is no moment where the brain announces its intentions. There is only the gradual discovery, usually during an unplanned gap in supply, that the flaw has been removed. Ryan's flaw had been removed approximately 8 weeks in. He knew this not because he understood neuroscience, but because he had felt the flaw disappear. 3 days of shaking hands, racing heart, a crawling sensation under his skin that sleep wouldn't touch, and a fear so formless and total it had no object. He had managed that episode with street supply. He had no intention of experiencing it again. So the pills became structural. Not recreational, not a crutch. Structural. The way load-bearing walls are structural. Remove them, and the building doesn't weaken. It collapses. A typical day for Ryan in the summer of 2013 had a pharmaceutical rhythm that he never acknowledged out loud, but organised everything around. Morning. 1 bar upon waking, because the overnight gap in dosing left him with a low-grade anxiety that made the alarm clock feel like a physical threat. The pill didn't produce euphoria at this point. Tolerance had stripped the pleasure out of it almost entirely. It simply restored him to functional, neutral, human-shaped enough to drive to work without his hand shaking on the wheel. Midday, another dose around lunch, because the morning pill wore off in 4 to 6 hours, and the logistics company's afternoon shift had a specific fluorescent-lit dread that his nervous system couldn't navigate unassisted. He kept pills in an Altoids tin in his desk drawer. None of his co-workers knew what was in the tin. His supervisor, a tired man named Greg who had stopped caring about everything except his retirement date, had noticed Ryan seemed spacey in the afternoons, but hadn't connected it to anything specific. Evening, the largest dose, because evenings were when the day's accumulated friction caught up to him, and because evenings were when Megan was home, and Megan was becoming harder to be around. Not because she was cruel, but because she was paying attention. Megan Durst had been Ryan's girlfriend for 14 months. She was 26, worked as a dental hygienist, and possessed the particular perceptiveness of someone who spends their professional life noticing things people are trying to hide. She'd begun noticing things about Ryan in April. By July, the list had grown long enough to keep her awake. He forgot conversations. Not vaguely, completely. She would reference something they had discussed the previous evening, and he would look at her with an expression that wasn't dismissive but genuinely blank. The conversation had simply not been stored. Whatever mechanism the brain uses to consolidate short-term experience into memory was being disrupted by the constant chemical sedation, and the result was that Ryan was losing hours, losing exchanges, losing the small accumulating record of a shared life. He was also slower, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to a stranger. But Megan knew his baseline. She knew the speed of his humour, the particular quickness with which he responded to things. That quickness had been replaced by something measured and careful, like a man navigating a room in the dark, placing each step deliberately, unwilling to trust the floor. She didn't know about the pills. She knew about the prescription. He'd told her about the panic attack, the doctor, the Xanax. But she didn't know about the street supply. She didn't know about the Altoids tin. She didn't know that what she was watching wasn't anxiety being treated, but a brain being systematically sedated beyond its own capacity to surface. She thought he was depressed. She suggested therapy twice. Both times, Ryan agreed that therapy was probably a good idea and then did nothing about it, not out of resistance, but because the pills had flattened his urgency about almost everything. When the chemical architecture is functioning correctly, nothing feels urgent, nothing feels like a crisis, nothing feels like much of anything. That was the seduction. That was also the trap. The prescription doctor's appointment in July was the last one Ryan attended. He'd been late on his rent twice. The street pills cost more than the prescription copay, and the math of financing a 4 to 6 milligram daily habit on a logistics coordinator's salary required the kind of creative accounting that leaves damage in its wake. He had stopped saving anything. He had stopped opening certain envelopes. He had developed, without consciously planning it, a hierarchy of payments. Pills first, rent second, everything else when possible. The doctor at the July appointment noticed the prescription refill pattern, too frequent, too accelerated, and declined to increase the dosage further. He suggested a tapering schedule. He printed a sheet with instructions. Ryan took the sheet, folded it, put it in his pocket, and threw it away in the parking garage on the way to his car. The tapering schedule assumed that the person tapering had access to a consistent, calibrated supply and the neurological stability to implement a gradual reduction. Ryan had neither. His supply was street-sourced and variable. His neurological stability was the thing he was trying to maintain with the supply. The tapering sheet might as well have been written in a language he didn't speak. He found a second street source that week, a guy named Marcus who operated out of an apartment complex on the east side of Columbus and who could reliably supply Xanax bars at $12 apiece, sold in strips of 10. The price was manageable if Ryan was careful. Ryan was not careful. Careful required a future orientation that the pills were actively suppressing. Each pill made the next one slightly more necessary and slightly easier to justify, and the justification never arrived with a warning label. Megan found the Altoids tin in late July. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for a phone charger in the bag Ryan had left by the couch, and her hand closed around something heavier than a mint tin should be. She opened it, counted, tried to calculate. Couldn't make the number make sense against what she knew about the prescription, which was supposed to be 1 milligram twice daily, and was definitely not supposed to live in a mint tin in a couch bag. Ryan's explanation was technically true in its individual components, and deeply misleading as a whole. He said the prescription bottle was inconvenient to carry. He said the dose had been adjusted. He said she was worrying about nothing. He delivered all three statements with the calm fluency of someone whose entire neurological state was devoted to maintaining equilibrium. And Megan, who loved him, who wanted to believe him, who had no framework yet for what she was actually looking at, let it go. She let it go the way you let go of a rope when you're not sure if you're holding it for your sake or the other person's. With effort, with unease, with the specific feeling of someone who has just been given an answer that answered nothing. 3 weeks later, Ryan called in sick to work for the second time in a month. He was not sick. He was managing a shortage. Marcus had been unreliable. The pharmacy wouldn't refill early, and the gap between what Ryan needed and what he had available was producing physical symptoms he could not function through. He spent the day on the couch, sweating lightly, jaw tight, watching television without registering any of it, counting down to the evening when a new connection was supposed to come through. The connection came through. The day ended. Ryan felt better within 40 minutes of the delivery. He sent Greg at work a text about a stomach bug. Greg replied with a get well soon and a reminder about the quarterly report. The logistics of a medium-sized freight company continued without interruption. Nobody knew anything. Everything was fine. Everything was not fine. But it felt that way, which in the architecture of this particular habit was the most dangerous thing of all. Marcus was not a villain. That's the first thing to understand about him. He was 28 years old, worked part-time at an auto parts store, and had stumbled into dealing benzodiazepines the way most people stumble into things that change their lives, not through grand ambition, but through proximity and opportunity. His cousin had a source. The demand in their social circle was visible and constant. The profit margin on a strip of 10 bars was better than 2 shifts at the auto parts store, and the risk felt abstract in the way that risks always feel abstract before they become concrete. Marcus didn't think of himself as a drug dealer in the cinematic sense. He thought of himself as a guy who provided something people were going to find somewhere anyway. The pharmaceutical companies had already created the demand. The doctors had already normalized the product. He was simply operating in the secondary market that the primary market had accidentally built. The logic was crooked, but it was logic, and it was shared by dozens of people like him in Columbus alone. By August of 2013, Ryan had moved from customer to regular, which in this economy meant he got slightly better prices and slightly more reliability in exchange for consistent volume. The transaction had the texture of a business relationship. Ryan wasn't buying from a stranger in an alley. He was texting Marcus on a Tuesday evening and picking up a strip from the glove compartment of a parked Civic in a shopping centre parking lot, and the whole thing took 4 minutes and felt less dangerous than it actually was. The social world that Ryan had drifted into was not a criminal underworld. It looked almost nothing like what most people imagine when they hear the word drug scene. It was house parties in ordinary apartments. It was a loose network of people in their 20s who shared a common pharmacological preference the way another group might share a preference for craft beer or a particular strain of marijuana. There were no passwords, no violence, no dramatic hierarchy. There was a couch, a television, some bottles of cheap whiskey, and a general understanding that certain pills were available if you knew to ask. This is the part of the story that the after-school specials never captured, the mundane sociability of benzodiazepine culture in early 2010s America. It didn't announce itself. It didn't look like danger. It looked like a Tuesday night with friends, and the pills looked like a shared preference, and the combination of the two looked like nothing worth worrying about. Ryan started attending these gatherings in August, introduced through Marcus's orbit. He fit naturally. He was personable when medicated, loose and funny in a way that his daily anxiety had been suppressing for years. The irony was bitter. The pills that were slowly dismantling his interior life were simultaneously making his social surface more appealing. He laughed more at these gatherings than he had laughed anywhere in recent memory. He felt, in the specific way that benzos manufacture, like everything was fine and the world was soft-edged and manageable. The alcohol arrived without ceremony, the way it always does. Nobody announced that mixing benzodiazepines with alcohol was a medically significant decision. It was just what happened at parties. You took a bar, someone handed you a drink, and the combination felt better than either substance alone. The reason it felt better is the reason it kills people. Both alcohol and benzodiazepines are central nervous system depressants. They target overlapping receptor systems. Together they don't just add, they multiply. That no one at a party in Columbus, Ohio in August 2013 was calculating. Ryan drank at these gatherings. Everyone drank. The combination became normal through repetition, the way most dangerous things become normal, not through a single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of uneventful nights that build a false statistical argument. We did this last week and nothing happened, so the risk is small. The blackout started in September. Not blackouts in the popular sense. Not unconsciousness. Not a visible collapse. Blackouts as in gaps. Periods of time that Ryan participated in but didn't record. He would surface from one of these gaps mid-sentence, mid-action, sometimes mid-drive, with no memory of how he'd arrived at the current moment. The sensation was less like waking up, and more like a film with missing frames, the narrative of his own life jumping from one point to another with nothing in between. He drove during at least 3 of these gaps. He knew this because he would find himself parked somewhere he had not consciously intended to park, with no memory of the journey. Once he found a fast food bag in his passenger seat from a restaurant he had no recollection of visiting. The bag was still warm. The brain under heavy benzodiazepine sedation, particularly in combination with alcohol, loses the ability to consolidate experience into memory in real time. The person remains functional in the narrow mechanical sense. The body navigates, the mouth speaks, the hands operate a vehicle. But the recording mechanism is offline. Whatever happened in those hours is gone, not suppressed, not retrievable under the right circumstances. Gone. Ryan knew the blackouts were happening because of the gaps in his own timeline, the warm fast food bags, the occasional text message he had apparently sent, but had no memory of composing. He found this frightening for approximately 48 hours after each discovery. Then the next dose arrived and the fear dissolved and the new baseline reset and the incident became a data point he filed somewhere he didn't visit. Darnell was different from Marcus in ways that mattered. He was 31, had 2 kids, and had been moving pills in Columbus for 4 years with the methodical competence of someone who understood the product deeply because he had once been a customer. He had stopped using benzos after a hospital stay 2 years earlier, a stay that had begun with a seizure in a Wendy's parking lot and ended with a discharge nurse explaining to him, very slowly, that he had been 11 minutes from irreversible brain damage. Darnell still sold. He told himself the rationalization that dealers tell themselves, if not him, someone else. But he kept the product away from his apartment, away from his kids, and away from his own nervous system with the vigilance of a man who understood exactly what he was distributing. He recognized the look of heavy dependency. He'd worn it himself, and he could see it in Ryan by the second time they met. Ryan entered Darnell's orbit when Marcus's supply dried up for 10 days in September. 10 days was not a manageable gap at Ryan's consumption level. Darnell agreed to supply him, priced fairly, no commentary. But Darnell watched. He noted the quantity Ryan was moving through per week, did the math, and arrived at a number that concerned him in the specific way that a former addict gets concerned. Not abstractly, but physically, with a kind of cellular recognition. He said nothing. The transaction continued. The silence was its own kind of failure, but it was not a simple one. The first near miss happened on a Friday night in early October. Ryan had spent the evening at a gathering in an apartment on the north side of Columbus. About 12 people, low light, the specific loose atmosphere of a group that has collectively decided the evening has no agenda. He had taken 2 bars earlier and drank steadily through the night, not dramatically, just consistently, the way you drink when you're already sedated enough that the alcohol seems to have less effect than usual. The apparent lack of effect was the warning he didn't read. Tolerance to the sedation doesn't mean the respiratory depression isn't happening. The nervous system was being suppressed whether Ryan felt it or not, and by midnight the suppression had accumulated to a point his body couldn't quietly manage. A girl named Jasmine found him in the parking lot, slumped against the rear tire of a car, eyes half open and unresponsive. She shook him. Nothing. She slapped him lightly on the face. His eyes moved but didn't focus. His breathing was slow, not absent, but slow in a way that a person who knew what to look for would have recognized as deeply wrong. 3 people gathered. Someone suggested calling 911. Someone else said that would involve police, and 2 people in the apartment had outstanding legal complications that made police contact inadvisable. The group chose another option. They positioned Ryan on his side. Someone knew about the recovery position, which was either luck or the result of someone having been in this situation before, and monitored him. He came around 40 minutes later, confused, slow, no memory of the parking lot. He thought he'd fallen asleep. Nobody called 911. Nobody told anyone. The apartment's informal social contract, the one that governs every gathering like this, in every city, in every year, sealed around the incident like water closing over a stone. By morning, it was something that had almost happened. By the following week, it was something people didn't mention. Ryan had no idea how close it had been. The people who did know chose the knowledge that was easier to live with, the knowledge that he had woken up, over the knowledge that was harder to carry, that the next time he might not. Megan noticed a bruise on his arm the following Monday that Ryan couldn't explain. He said he'd bumped into something. She looked at him for a long moment, not the look of someone who believes the answer, but the look of someone who has decided, for reasons she's still working out, not to push further. The distance between them had been expanding since spring, measured not in arguments but in silences. Silences at dinner. Silences in the car. The particular silence of two people who used to talk easily, and now navigate each other carefully, both aware that something has changed and neither prepared to name it. She started sleeping earlier. He started coming home later. The logistics of cohabitation continued. The shared groceries, the bills split down the middle, the surface function of a relationship, but the interior of it had gone cold in the way that interiors go cold when the person at the centre of them is no longer entirely present. Ryan felt the distance. The pills didn't eliminate feeling. They flattened it, which is different. He knew Megan was unhappy. He knew he was the reason. He knew, in the abstract way that heavy sedation permits knowing things without acting on them, that something was wrong and getting worse. He took another bar. The knowledge moved to the place where he kept the other things he wasn't dealing with. The evening continued. The apartment was quiet. Outside, Columbus went about its October business, indifferent and ongoing, while inside a two-bedroom on the west side, a young woman looked at the ceiling and a young man stared at a television screen, and neither of them said anything at all. The body keeps its own accounting. It doesn't send reminders. It doesn't offer payment plans. It simply accumulates what it's owed and presents the bill when the balance becomes impossible to ignore. By October of 2013, Ryan's body had been running a deficit for 7 months, and the collection notices were arriving in a language he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The weight loss came first, gradual enough that he hadn't noticed it himself, visible enough that his mother noticed it immediately the first time she saw him after a 6-week gap. Carol Calloway had driven down from the North Columbus suburb where she and Dennis still lived, stopped by Ryan's apartment with a container of food she'd made, and stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted longer than a doorway moment should. He had lost perhaps 15 pounds since she'd last seen him. His face had the specific gauntness that comes not from healthy weight loss, but from the body consuming its own reserves, the hollowed-out look of someone whose nutrition has become secondary to something else. Ryan explained it as stress. Work was demanding. He hadn't been eating regularly. Both things were technically true. Carol accepted the explanation in the way mothers accept explanations they don't fully believe, filing it under a category of worry she couldn't yet act on, carrying it home in the passenger seat alongside the empty food container he'd sent back with her. The speech changes were subtler but more alarming to those paying attention. Ryan's words occasionally ran together at the edges, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in a way that introduced a half-second of wrongness into his sentences, a slight softening of consonants and timing that his supervisor Greg had begun to notice during afternoon check-ins. Greg had pulled him aside once in late October, Not aggressively, but with the careful tone of a man trying to avoid a conversation he didn't want to be having. The issue was logged internally as a performance concern. No formal action was taken. Greg went back to thinking about retirement. Megan left on a Wednesday in early November. Not explosively. Not with accusations or revelations or the kind of confrontation that at least has the dignity of clarity. She left the way people leave when they've been grieving someone for months before the actual departure. Quietly, with bags she'd been packing in her mind since August, and with a note on the kitchen counter that said she needed space, and that she hoped he was okay, and that she would be at her sister's. Ryan found the note when he got home from work. He read it twice. He sat on the couch for an hour. Then he took a bar, and the sharp edge of the loss, that first raw moment of understanding that something is genuinely gone, softened into something he could carry without it destroying him. This was the cruelest function of the pills at this stage of his dependency. They didn't prevent him from understanding what was happening to his life. They prevented him from feeling the full weight of it, which is the same as preventing him from having the full, unmedicated reaction that might have constituted a turning point. Every crisis that might have been a catalyst was chemically reduced to a manageable inconvenience. The pills were not just sedating his nervous system. They were sedating his capacity for the kind of pain that saves people. Megan would not come back. She would text once 2 weeks later, asking if he was okay. He would say yes. She would not text again after that. Ryan's attempt to stop came from a place of pure fear, not resolve. That distinction matters. It happened in late October, before Megan left. A night when he'd run short again, when the supply gap was 12 hours rather than days, and the withdrawal symptoms arrived faster and harder than any previous episode. He had been through gaps before. This one felt categorically different. His hands didn't just shake. They trembled with a fine, constant vibration he couldn't still. His jaw clenched involuntarily. A headache built behind his eyes with the specific pressure of something structural rather than incidental. He made it through the night. Barely and miserably, but he made it. By morning, he'd been without alprazolam for 14 hours and had decided in the unsteady logic of 4 a.m. clarity that he was going to stop. Cold turkey. Right now. He poured the remaining pills from his Altoids tin into the toilet and flushed them before he could reverse the decision. He felt briefly the specific pride of someone who has just done something difficult and correct. By hour 18, the pride was gone. The withdrawal from benzodiazepines is not popularly understood to be life-threatening, and this misconception kills people. Opioid withdrawal is agonizing but rarely fatal in otherwise healthy adults. Benzo withdrawal, particularly from high doses taken over months, can trigger grand mal seizures, psychosis, cardiovascular instability, and death. The mechanism is the same one that makes alcohol withdrawal dangerous. The GABA system, suppressed for so long, snaps back toward hyperactivity when the suppression is removed, and the resulting neurological overexcitation doesn't stay neatly contained within the category of discomfort. Ryan didn't know this. He knew he felt terrible. He knew his heart was racing at a rate that felt wrong. He knew that by hour 22 his vision had developed a trembling quality at the edges, and that by hour 26 he had experienced 2 episodes of muscle rigidity so severe that he'd bitten his tongue during the second one. He did not go to the hospital. The logic he used to avoid going was the logic of someone whose threat assessment system had been chemically impaired for months. The hospital would cost money he didn't have, would require explanations he didn't want to give, and would involve a level of official acknowledgement of his situation that felt more threatening than the symptoms themselves. He called Marcus instead. Marcus came through in 3 hours. Ryan took 2 bars, and the seizure-adjacent trembling slowed, then stopped. His heart rate descended. The edge of the visual field steadied. His nervous system, pulled back from the brink of acute withdrawal, settled into its medicated equilibrium and stayed there. Ryan sat on his bathroom floor for a long time after that. He was shaking for a different reason now. Not neurological, but the kind of shaking that comes from having been very close to something terrible without fully understanding how close. The realization arrived in pieces. He had not stopped using because he wanted to use. He had restarted because his body had left him no other option. The distinction between addiction and choice had collapsed entirely, and he was now managing what amounted to a medical condition: benzodiazepine dependency with physical withdrawal risk, with street-sourced drugs, alone, in a bathroom in Columbus, Ohio, with no medical supervision and no safety net. He flushed the toilet. He went to bed. He woke up the next morning and took his first pill of the day. The physical inventory continued to grow. Memory deterioration had progressed from occasional gaps to a more pervasive impairment. Ryan would forget things in real time, setting something down and losing it within minutes, beginning sentences and losing the destination midway through. His co-worker at the logistics company, a woman named Priya who worked the adjacent desk, had stopped asking him things she needed to remember because she had learned that Ryan's confirmation of something was not reliable. She had done this without comment and without cruelty, simply because she was practical and needed things to get done. Ryan had noticed but not mentioned it. Noticing without acting had become his primary mode of self-awareness. His appetite was erratic, some days almost absent, other days producing a sudden ravenous hunger that he fed with whatever required the least preparation. The weight loss Carol had noticed in October continued into November. He was 20 to 25 pounds below his baseline weight, and the loss had reached the point where his clothes had begun to fit incorrectly, which is the kind of detail that is visible to everyone who looks and invisible to the person experiencing it. Sleep had fractured into something unrecognizable. Benzos are sedating, which creates the superficial appearance of sleep. Ryan fell unconscious easily enough. But benzodiazepine-induced sleep lacks the deep restorative stages that the brain requires to function and to heal. The architecture of his nights was chemical sedation rather than genuine rest, and the cumulative sleep debt was compounding in ways that blurred the line between the side effects of the drug and the symptoms of the withdrawal he never fully experienced anymore because he never fully stopped. He was medicating withdrawal with the substance that was causing the withdrawal. The cycle was complete and self-sustaining and getting tighter with each week. Carol called every Sunday. The calls had a pattern she'd established without announcing it. She called at 11 a.m., kept the conversation light, listened very carefully to everything Ryan said and didn't say, and hung up with a sensation in her chest that she privately called dread, but told herself was just motherly worry. In November she called, and Ryan didn't answer. She called again an hour later. Still nothing. She drove to the apartment, 40 minutes, no traffic, a drive she told herself she was taking calmly and made in 35 minutes. She knocked. He answered, sleep slow and confused, having apparently been unconscious at 11 a.m. on a Sunday for no reason he could articulate. Carol stood in the apartment and looked at her son the way doctors look at an X-ray. Not at the surface, but through it, at the structure underneath. He was thinner than last time. His eyes had the unfocused quality of someone woken from deep sedation. The apartment was in the functional disorder of a person managing alone on a narrowing margin. Dishes done, floor swept, but surfaces covered with the accumulated low-level debris of someone who has stopped caring about the difference between temporary and permanent. She asked if he was okay. He said yes. She asked if he was taking care of himself. He said of course. She stayed for 2 hours, cleaned the kitchen without making it an act of criticism, left the food she'd brought and drove home. In the car, she called Dennis. She said she thought something was seriously wrong. Dennis said Ryan was young and probably just going through a rough patch. Carol said she didn't think it was a rough patch. She said she thought it was something specific and something they needed to address directly. Dennis said they should give it a little more time. Carol would spend the next 11 months regretting every day of that little more time. The job at the logistics company ended on a Tuesday in mid-November, via a meeting that lasted 8 minutes. Greg delivered the news with the exhausted brevity of a man who had been postponing it for weeks. Performance issues, attendance record, a pattern of behaviour that the company couldn't continue to accommodate. Ryan would receive 2 weeks of severance. His final day was that Friday. Ryan nodded throughout the meeting. He thanked Greg, which was either genuine or reflexive. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. He returned to his desk, sat for a moment, and then methodically gathered the few personal items from his workspace: a phone charger, a coffee mug, the Altoids tin. He put them in his bag. He logged out of the company system for the last time. He drove home. He took 2 bars. He spent the afternoon on the couch watching something on television that he would not remember the following morning. The loss of the job removed his last structured external reason to maintain any semblance of daily function. The prescription, already technically invalid since he'd stopped seeing the doctor, was now also financially unsustainable without income. The street supply was his only supply, and the street supply required money he no longer had a consistent source of. The arithmetic of his situation had become impossible, but impossibility, under sufficient chemical sedation, can feel exactly like a Tuesday afternoon. Carol Calloway found out about the pills on a Thursday. Not through a confession. Ryan wasn't capable of a confession at this point, not because he was dishonest by nature, but because the chemical architecture of his dependency had made honesty feel like a structural threat. The truth came through a phone call from Megan, who had been carrying what she knew for weeks, and had finally decided that carrying it alone was no longer something she was willing to do. She called Carol, spoke for 20 minutes, and at the end of those 20 minutes Carol sat at her kitchen table with a notepad and a pen and wrote down everything Megan had told her. The list was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was specific. The Altoids tin, the quantity, the street sources, the blackout in October that Megan had heard about second-hand from someone who'd been at the gathering, the weight loss, the memory gaps, the cold turkey attempt that had ended with Ryan shaking on a bathroom floor. Each item on the list was a fact, and the facts assembled into a picture that Carol had been refusing to see in its totality, because seeing it meant she had been seeing it and doing nothing about it for months. She called Dennis. He came home from work early. They sat at the kitchen table together and looked at the list and stopped using the phrase rough patch. By that evening, Carol had begun making phone calls. The American healthcare system of 2013, encountered from the outside in a state of crisis, resembled nothing so much as a building with many doors, most of which were locked, some of which led to rooms with waiting lists, and a few of which opened into spaces that cost more than a family earned in a year. Carol was a methodical person. She had raised 2 children, managed a household, and worked 20 years as a school administrator. She understood bureaucracy, understood paperwork, understood the specific discipline of making phone calls that go unreturned and trying again without losing the thread. She applied all of that competence to the problem of finding her son treatment, and she was, despite everything she brought to the task, repeatedly and systematically failed by the infrastructure she was navigating. The first call was to Ryan's insurance. Ryan had lost his employer-provided coverage the day the logistics company let him go. He had not enrolled in COBRA continuation coverage. The monthly premium was $340, and without income, $340 might as well have been $3,400. He was uninsured. This was not unusual in 2013 America, 2 years before the Affordable Care Act's major provisions took full effect. Approximately 45 million Americans were uninsured that year. Ryan was simply one of them. The second call was to a residential treatment facility in Columbus. The intake coordinator was professional and thorough. She explained the program, its duration, 28 days minimum, its approach, its qualifications. Then she mentioned the cost, $18,000 for the standard program, payable in advance without insurance. Carol wrote down the number. She thanked the coordinator. She hung up and sat for a moment with the understanding that $18,000 was not a number she and Dennis could access without refinancing the house, and that refinancing the house was not something that could happen in the timeline that Ryan's situation required. The third call was to a different facility, $12,000, still residential, shorter program, fewer amenities, still not possible without significant financial mobilization that would take weeks to arrange. The fourth call was to the County Mental Health Board, which provided a list of publicly funded treatment options. 2 of the 3 programs on the list had waiting times of between 4 and 6 months. The third had a 6-week wait. 6 weeks, measured against Ryan's current daily consumption and the physical withdrawal risk Carol now understood he carried, was not a comfort. It was a calendar of potential emergencies. She drove to Ryan's apartment on Friday, told him what she knew, told him she was going to help him get treatment. Ryan's response was not the one Carol had scripted in her head during the 40-minute drive. He didn't deny it. He didn't get angry. He said, with the flat effect of someone whose emotional range had been pharmaceutically compressed for 8 months, that he knew he needed help and that he had been trying to figure out how to get it. He said the word trying in a way that meant he had thought about it and done nothing, which is what trying means when the substance you're dependent on is also the substance suppressing your capacity for decisive action. Carol told him about the waiting lists, about the costs, about the options she'd found. Ryan listened. His hands were steady. He'd dosed recently. His eyes tracked her correctly. He looked from a distance, like someone having a reasonable conversation about a manageable problem. He was not managing a manageable problem. He was a man with a medically dangerous physical dependency. No income, no insurance, no doctor, managing his withdrawal risk with inconsistently sourced street drugs, and the most immediate help the system could offer him was a 6-week wait and a list of phone numbers. Dr. Hargrove had no idea. This is not an indictment of Dr. Hargrove specifically. It's a description of how the system functioned. He was a general practitioner at a walk-in clinic carrying a patient load that averaged 35 people per day, operating within a reimbursement structure that rewarded throughput over follow-up. When Ryan had stopped making appointments in July, Hargrove's practice management software had generated an automated reminder, which went unanswered, which triggered no escalation protocol because no escalation protocol existed for a patient who simply stopped showing up. Hargrove had written the initial prescription in good faith, within clinical guidelines, for a patient presenting with documented anxiety symptoms. He had noted the prescription in the chart, flagged it for short-term use, and scheduled a follow-up that the patient had attended once and then stopped attending. What happened after that last appointment existed entirely outside the clinical record. He didn't know Ryan was buying street bars. He did not know Ryan was consuming 4 to 6 times the prescribed dose. He did not know Ryan had attempted cold turkey withdrawal and nearly seized. He did not know Ryan was now unemployed, uninsured, and managing physical dependency with increasingly unreliable supply from an informal network of distributors. The clinical record showed a young man with mild anxiety who had been prescribed a low-dose benzodiazepine and had missed follow-up appointments. It was not a red flag file. It did not look like a crisis. The gap between the clinical record and the reality of Ryan's life was not the result of negligence in any simple sense. It was the result of a system that had no mechanism for seeing what happened to patients after they walked out of the examination room. Carol found the free clinic through a social worker she reached on her 9th phone call, a woman named Patricia, who worked for a non-profit and who had, by the specific competence of someone doing difficult work in an underfunded space, an actual working knowledge of what was available in Columbus for someone in Ryan's situation. The free clinic operated out of a church building on the east side of Columbus 3 days a week, staffed by volunteer physicians and funded by a combination of grants and private donations. Carol drove Ryan there on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November. The physician who saw Ryan was a retired internist named Dr. Chen, who had been volunteering at the clinic for 6 years and who recognized benzodiazepine dependency with the ease of someone who had seen it many times. He reviewed Ryan's history, the full history, which Ryan disclosed more completely than he had disclosed anything to anyone, perhaps because the free clinic felt like a place without consequences, or perhaps because he had reached the point where the weight of concealment was heavier than the weight of exposure. Dr. Chen explained the withdrawal risk carefully and directly. He explained that unsupervised cold turkey was dangerous at Ryan's consumption level. He explained that a medically supervised tapering protocol, a gradual calibrated reduction of dosage over weeks, was the appropriate approach, and that it required access to a consistent pharmaceutical-grade supply and medical monitoring that the free clinic was not equipped to provide on an ongoing basis. Then he wrote Ryan a prescription. A short-term bridge prescription, 2 weeks of low-dose alprazolam, calibrated to reduce the immediate overdose and withdrawal risk, while Carol continued pursuing treatment options. It was the right call medically and an impossible situation institutionally. The free clinic had just prescribed more of the drug that had destroyed 8 months of Ryan's life, because the alternative, cutting off his supply without medical support, risked his life more acutely than continuing it. The system's solution to the problem the system had created was more of the substance the system had normalized. Carol drove home in silence. The prescription sat in her bag. Ryan sat in the passenger seat looking out the window at Columbus passing by. The strip malls, the bare November trees, the ordinary American infrastructure of a city that had no idea what was happening inside 1,000 apartments just like his. The non-profit rehabilitation program that Patricia the social worker had identified had 1 slot available, not in 6 weeks, but in 3, due to a cancellation. It was a 21-day residential program, sliding scale cost based on income, with a minimum payment of $800 for someone with no income. Carol said she would cover the cost without hesitating. The 3 weeks between the free clinic visit and the program start date were the most dangerous weeks Ryan had experienced, for reasons that had nothing to do with his own behavior and everything to do with the supply chain. Marcus had gone quiet. A supply disruption upstream, the kind of invisible logistics problem that illegal markets experience constantly, had reduced the availability of bars in his network significantly. Prices had risen. Reliability had dropped. Ryan, managing on the bridge prescription plus whatever he could source from Marcus's intermittently available supply, was living in a state of constant low-grade withdrawal anxiety that the prescribed dose wasn't fully suppressing. He called Darnell for the first time since September. Darnell picked up. He could supply, he said. He had product. Ryan gave him the address. What neither of them knew, what nobody in the Columbus Street supply chain had been clearly informed about yet, was that a batch of counterfeit bars had entered the local market sometime in early November. They looked identical to the pharmaceutical product. They were pressed to the same dimensions, the same white colour, the same scoreline down the middle. But they had been manufactured without quality control, which meant the alprazolam content per pill varied wildly. Some were underdosed, Some were 2 or 3 times stronger than marked, and some contained compounds that weren't alprazolam at all. Darnell's supply had come from a source 1 step removed from his usual one. He did not know about the counterfeit batch. He had no way of knowing. The pills looked right. They always looked right. Ryan picked up 10 bars on a Wednesday evening. He paid. He went home. He took one before bed and noticed it hit harder than usual, faster onset, deeper sedation. He attributed it to his reduced tolerance from the slightly lower recent dosing. He went to sleep. He woke up the next morning with the specific heaviness of someone who has been more deeply sedated than intended. He made coffee. He took his bridge prescription dose. He put the remaining 9 bars in the Altoids tin. 3 weeks until the program. 9 bars in a tin. A rehabilitation slot with his name on it. 3 weeks out. In a system that had taken Carol 11 days and 43 phone calls to access. The distance between Ryan and safety was now measurable. It had a number. It had a date on a calendar. What it didn't have was a guarantee, because the pills in the Altoids tin were not what they appeared to be, and the variable in that equation was still moving, invisible and unannounced, toward an outcome that no calendar could account for. Ryan Calloway was not a statistic, but he was also not alone, and the distance between those two facts is where the real horror of 2013 lives. While Carol was making her 43 phone calls, while Ryan was counting bars in an Altoids tin, while Darnell was unknowingly distributing counterfeit product through a supply chain nobody was monitoring, the same story was playing out across Columbus in a dozen variations, with a dozen different faces, all running toward the same small number of exits. In 2013, benzodiazepine prescriptions in the United States had reached a volume that the medical establishment would later describe, with a careful understatement of institutional self-examination, as concerning. Alprazolam alone was the most prescribed psychiatric medication in the country. Not the most prescribed among psychiatric medications. The most prescribed psychiatric medication. Period. More than antidepressants. More than antipsychotics. A drug designed for short-term anxiety management had become the dominant chemical response to the mental health of an entire nation. The emergency rooms in Columbus were seeing the results. Benzodiazepine-related ER visits nationally had more than doubled between 2004 and 2011, and the curve hadn't flattened. In Ohio specifically, a state already absorbing the early shock of the opioid epidemic, the benzo crisis ran alongside the opioid crisis like a shadow epidemic, quieter and less photographed but equally destructive. The combination of the two was the specific detail that made toxicologists and emergency physicians lose sleep. Opioids and benzodiazepines together suppressed respiration with a synergistic lethality that made the sum catastrophically greater than its parts. Nobody on the national news was talking about it yet. The vocabulary hadn't been built. The story hadn't been assigned. 17-year-old Kayla Simmons got her first Xanax bar at a house party in Westerville in September 2013. She was a junior in high school, honor roll, swim team, the kind of teenager whose exterior competence made adults assume her interior was equally organized. It wasn't. High school had developed, in the years since the recession reshaped her family's finances, a specific social anxiety she managed through performance, performing confidence, performing ease, performing the version of herself that other people seemed to find acceptable. The performance was exhausting in the way that long-running performances always are. Someone at the party offered her a bar the way someone might offer a piece of gum, casually, without drama, with the social framing that suggested this was an ordinary thing that ordinary people did at ordinary parties. She took half. The relief she felt within 40 minutes was not dramatically different from what Ryan had felt in that clinic parking lot 8 months earlier. the same sudden absence of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped registering it as weight. She took the other half an hour later. By October, Kayla had a source through a senior at her school who sourced from someone who sourced from someone whose supply chain eventually connected, through several degrees of separation, to the same disrupted network that had introduced counterfeit bars into Columbus. She didn't know this. She was 17 years old and thought she had found something that made the unbearable social pressure of being a high-functioning teenager in a financially stressed family briefly, blessedly quiet. Her parents noticed she was calmer. They thought therapy was working. Kayla wasn't in therapy. 45-year-old Gerald Marsh had been prescribed Klonopin, a longer-acting benzodiazepine, by a VA physician in 2011 for PTSD following 2 deployments to Iraq. The prescription was legitimate and the diagnosis was real. Gerald had come home from his second tour with the specific interior damage that combat produces in people who are not built for it, which is to say, most people, and the PTSD had expressed itself in nightmares, hypervigilance, and a startle response so severe that a car backfiring on his street could send him to the floor. The Klonopin helped. It helped enough that Gerald had stayed on it far past the recommended duration, and his VA physician had continued prescribing it because the alternatives, trauma therapy, EMDR, the longer and harder work of actual treatment, were available in theory and backed up for months in practice. By 2013, Gerald was supplementing his prescription with street-sourced bars because the VA prescription wasn't enough anymore, and the VA appointment to discuss dosage was 3 months out. He was self-managing a benzodiazepine dependency in a 2-bedroom house in South Columbus, raising a teenage son more or less alone, working part-time as a security guard at a mall where the fluorescent lights and the PA announcements occasionally produced responses in his nervous system that he managed by excusing himself to the parking lot and waiting for his hands to stop shaking. He had applied for increased VA disability benefits in June. The application was still pending in November. Gerald had learned, through 2 deployments and 4 years of bureaucratic navigation post-service, that the government's timeline and the human body's timeline were not the same document. Sandra Kowalski was 41, a licensed practical nurse at a mid-sized hospital in Columbus, and she'd been stealing benzodiazepines from the hospital's medication supply for 6 months, not in large quantities. She was methodical about it, the way competent people are methodical about the things they shouldn't be doing, taking small amounts from multiple sources, staying below the threshold that automated inventory systems flagged, rotating her methods to avoid patterns. She'd not started stealing because she was careless or criminal by nature. She'd started because she needed the pills and couldn't get enough through legitimate channels without raising questions she couldn't afford to answer. Sandra's dependency had begun with a prescription after a back surgery in 2012, progressed in the standard way, and arrived at the inevitable junction where the prescription was insufficient and the alternatives were too expensive or too slow. She had the specific disadvantage of working in healthcare. She understood exactly what was happening to her neurologically, which somehow made it worse rather than better. Knowing the mechanism of your own trap doesn't open it. She told herself she would stop stealing when she found another solution. She'd been telling herself this for 4 months. The other solution had not materialized. The stealing had continued. In November, the hospital's pharmacy began a quarterly audit. Sandra knew the audit was coming. She'd been through 3 of them. She also knew that this time the numbers might not reconcile cleanly. She spent the 2 weeks before the audit doing her job with the outward calm of someone who's become very good at separating her interior from her exterior, and the specific private dread of someone waiting for a door to open that they cannot prevent from opening. What connected Ryan, Kayla, Gerald and Sandra? beyond the obvious pharmacological thread, was the shared experience of navigating a system that had two completely different faces depending on which side of it you were on. From the prescribing side, benzodiazepines in 2013 looked like a well-understood, well-regulated class of medications with clear clinical guidelines and an established safety profile. Physicians prescribed them, pharmacies dispensed them, insurance covered them. The infrastructure of legitimacy was complete. From the dependency side, the same system looked like a maze with no exit signs. Too expensive, too slow, too fragmented, too reliant on the individual's capacity for self-advocacy at precisely the moment when the substance undermining that capacity was the substance requiring treatment. The cruel design flaw at the center of benzodiazepine addiction treatment in America was that the drug most aggressively suppressed the executive function, motivation, and future orientation that navigating the treatment system required. To get help, you needed to be capable of sustained, organized effort. The drug made sustained, organized effort nearly impossible. The people who successfully accessed treatment were disproportionately the ones with a Carol in their lives, someone else providing the executive function, making the 43 phone calls, sitting in the waiting room, driving to the free clinic, holding the calendar open to the date 3 weeks out. Ryan had Carol. Gerald had nobody except a VA system moving at institutional speed. Kayla had parents who didn't know what they were looking for. Sandra had a hospital audit closing in. The outcomes were already beginning to diverge. Gerald Marsh's son found him unresponsive on the kitchen floor on a Saturday morning in late November. Not dead. Not in a way that required an ambulance, though the boy, who was 15, spent 40 seconds believing otherwise. Gerald had mixed his Klonopin with 2 beers the night before, a combination he had made dozens of times without incident. But the street-sourced bars he'd added to his usual dose that evening had come from the same contaminated batch moving through Columbus. The inconsistent dosage had pushed the combination past his tolerance ceiling. His son called 911. The paramedics arrived, administered flumazenil, a benzodiazepine reversal agent, and Gerald surfaced. He was hospitalized for 36 hours. He was discharged with a referral to outpatient treatment and a follow-up appointment at the VA. The VA appointment was confirmed for February. Gerald went home. His son, who was 15 and had found his father on the kitchen floor, went back to school on Monday and told nobody what had happened. Children of people in crisis develop the same silence as everyone else in the orbit of addiction. The silence of people who have learned that saying the thing out loud sometimes makes it more real and less manageable, not less. Kayla Simmons was caught in December, not by her parents, by a teacher who noticed the specific signs in a way that teachers occasionally do when they're paying attention. The school's response was a meeting with the counselor, a call to her parents, and a referral to an outpatient program. Kayla was 17, had been using for 3 months, and her physical dependency, while real, was less entrenched than someone who'd been using at higher doses for longer. The outpatient program would work, eventually imperfectly, in the long way that these things work. But Kayla's entry point, a house party in Westerville, a half a bar offered casually, no warning, no context, had not changed. The next 17-year-old at the next party in the next suburb was facing the identical entry point, and nobody was standing there to change the framing. Sandra's audit happened in the second week of December. The numbers didn't reconcile. The hospital's investigation was swift and thorough. Healthcare institutions move faster on internal theft than on almost any other category of problem. Sandra was suspended pending investigation, then terminated, then reported to the state nursing board. Her license was suspended. She lost her job, her professional license, and her access to the hospital's medication supply simultaneously, while still being physically dependent on benzodiazepines and now without income or insurance. The system had correctly identified the theft and correctly responded to it. What the system had not done, what the system had no mechanism for doing, was treat the underlying dependency before the theft occurred, at any of the multiple earlier points when Sandra had been a patient rather than a perpetrator. Ryan knew none of these people. Their paths hadn't crossed and wouldn't. But they were breathing the same air in the same city in the same November, all caught in variations of the same machinery, all moving at slightly different speeds towards slightly different walls. The counterfeit bars were still circulating. The supply chain had no recall mechanism, no quality control, no warning system. The pills moved from hand to hand through the informal economy of need and proximity, each transfer a degree further from any information about what was actually inside them. Ryan had 9 of them in an Altoids tin. He was managing them carefully, rationing against the bridge prescription, counting days. 15 days until the program, then 13, then 10. He was being careful. He had reasons to be careful now. A date, a slot, a mother who called every day and drove over twice that week just to see his face. The shape of a future had appeared on the calendar, small and imperfect but real. He was being careful, and the pills in the tin were not the pills they appeared to be, and careful was not the same as safe. And in the gap between those two words, an entire city was quietly discovering the cost of the distinction. The gathering on the 14th of November wasn't planned as anything significant. It was a Thursday evening at an apartment belonging to a guy named Trey. 26, worked at a tyre shop, hosted these kinds of loose, undeclared gatherings the way some people host dinner parties, which is to say regularly and without much ceremony. 8 people total. The kind of number where the room feels occupied but not crowded, where conversations happen in 2s and 3s, and the television plays something nobody is watching. November outside the windows, cold and flat and dark by 5 in the evening the way Ohio Novembers are. Ryan had been to Trey's before. The familiarity of the space made it feel low risk. Not a new environment, not unknown people, not a situation that required heightened alertness. He had told Carol he was staying in that evening. He had meant it when he said it. The invitation from Trey came at 7, a text message that read simply, "Come through," and Ryan had looked at his apartment, at the walls, at the specific quality of silence that had inhabited the place since Megan left, and made the decision in under a minute. He took 1 bar from the Altoids tin before he left. The drive was 12 minutes. He parked, went upstairs, and entered a room that looked exactly like it had every other time. What Ryan didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the counterfeit batch had arrived at Trey's through a completely separate channel from Darnell's supply. Trey had sourced from a contact he used occasionally, a peripheral figure in the Columbus supply network who had no connection to Marcus or Darnell, and who had acquired his product from a wholesaler operating out of Cincinnati. The Cincinnati source was the origin point of the contaminated batch, the location where someone with a pill press and no chemistry background had manufactured convincing-looking alprazolam bars with a dosage consistency of a coin flip. Some bars from this batch contained 2 milligrams, standard. Some contained 5. Some contained compounds that weren't alprazolam at all, but clonazepam and diazepam in combinations that produced a longer, deeper, and less predictable sedation. One analysis conducted later by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation would find a bar from this batch containing 8 milligrams of active benzodiazepine compound, 4 times the standard dose, indistinguishable from the outside. The bars were available at Trey's that evening the way snacks were available at a party, present, accessible, their presence assumed. Ryan had one. He'd been managing his intake carefully all week, rationing, staying functional. 1 bar in a familiar setting with people he knew. That was the calculation. The alcohol entered the calculation 30 minutes later, as it always did. The specific pharmacological catastrophe of that evening assembled itself in stages that no single person in the room could see, because each stage looked, from the inside, like the previous one. Ryan's first bar hit harder than expected, the counterfeit dosing doing its invisible work. He attributed the stronger onset to his week of careful rationing, to slightly lower tolerance. He drank 2 beers over the following hour, slowly, not dramatically. Someone passed another bar around the room the way things get passed at these gatherings. Not forced, not pressured, just available and ambient. Ryan took it. He'd had one from the tin at home, one here, 2 beers. By his internal accounting, he was within range. His internal accounting was wrong by a factor he had no mechanism for calculating. The hydrocodone was the element that no plan had included. Someone at the gathering had a prescription, a genuine one, post-dental procedure, and had brought several pills with the casual generosity of someone who doesn't fully understand what they're contributing to a room that already contains 2 central nervous system depressants at elevated dosing. Ryan was offered one. He hesitated for a moment. Opioids weren't his drug, he'd used them only occasionally, and then took it. The hesitation lasted approximately 4 seconds. The 3 substances hit the same biological target from 3 different angles simultaneously. Benzodiazepines suppress the GABA system. Opioids suppress the mu-opioid receptors that regulate breathing. Alcohol suppresses the central nervous system globally. In combination, at the doses now active in Ryan's bloodstream, doses he couldn't accurately calculate because the bars were counterfeit, and the alcohol was social, and the hydrocodone was a last-minute addition, the suppressive effect on his respiratory system was not additive. It was multiplicative. His breathing slowed, not suddenly, gradually in increments too small to observe in real time. He was sitting on Trey's couch, part of a conversation he was still technically participating in, his responses becoming slower and further spaced, his body sinking into the cushions in a way that looked like deep relaxation rather than what it actually was. Nobody noticed the transition because the transition had no clear beginning. One moment he was present in the way heavily sedated people are present, physically there, intermittently responsive. The next moment he wasn't responding at all, his head tilted back against the couch, his breathing reduced to something shallow and slow and wrong. Trey noticed first. He said Ryan's name. Nothing. He said it louder. One of Ryan's eyes moved slightly but didn't open. Trey put a hand on Ryan's chest and felt the breathing, or rather felt the inadequacy of it, the long pauses between rises, the shallow, inadequate movement of a chest that wasn't doing enough work. Someone said the word ambulance. Someone else said, wait. The same social calculus that had operated in the October parking lot activated instantly. The fear of police, the fear of legal exposure, the fear of what an official response would mean for the people in the room. 3 seconds of hesitation that felt like 30. Trey made the call. Whatever his reasons, whatever the calculation, he picked up his phone and dialed 911 at the moment that the hesitation broke, and the dispatcher's voice entered the room and changed what happened next. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. 6 minutes is not a long time by most measurements. By respiratory depression measurements, 6 minutes is a document with a great deal of information in it. Ryan's oxygen saturation when the paramedics reached him was 74%. Normal is 95 to 100. At 74%, the brain is receiving oxygen at a level insufficient for normal function. At levels below 70, permanent neurological damage begins accumulating. The paramedics' first action was a bag valve mask, manual assisted ventilation, forcing air into lungs that had essentially stopped volunteering. The lead paramedic, A woman named Torres with 8 years of experience and the specific calm of someone who has done this enough times to have lost the capacity for panic, assessed the scene in under 30 seconds. Multiple substances. Deep CNS depression. She administered naloxone first, the opioid reversal agent, because it acts fastest and the opioid component was the most immediately addressable. Partial response. She administered flumazenil, the benzodiazepine reversal agent, with caution, because in a patient with heavy benzodependency, too rapid reversal can trigger immediate acute withdrawal and seizure. Ryan's body was now a pharmacological battlefield, with reversal agents competing against the accumulated depressants in his bloodstream, while his respiratory system tried to decide whether to continue operating. Torres worked on him for 11 minutes in the apartment before they moved him. 11 minutes of controlled, technical, experienced intervention between Ryan Calloway and the specific outcome that had been building since March. 11 minutes that his October parking lot near miss had not required, because that evening hadn't been quite this far. This evening was this far. The ambulance ride took 9 minutes. Ryan did not regain consciousness during it. His oxygen saturation climbed slowly under assisted ventilation. 74 to 79. Pause. 79 to 83. Another pause, the numbers moving with the reluctant incrementalism of a body being pulled back from a distance it had travelled willingly. Carol received the call at 10:47 p.m. The voice on the phone was a nurse at Ohio State Wexner Medical Center, professional and careful, using the language hospitals use when they're telling you something serious without telling you the worst version of it yet. Ryan Calloway had been brought in. He was being stabilized. She should come. Carol was in the car before the call ended. She drove the 40 minutes in 31. Dennis followed 5 minutes behind her. Neither of them spoke to each other on their phones during the drive because there was nothing to say that could survive being said at 75 miles per hour on a November highway with the radio off and the city lights coming up ahead. The ICU had the specific quality of stillness that intensive care units have at midnight. Not peaceful, but suspended. The stillness of a place where things are being carefully prevented from getting worse. Ryan was in a bed with monitors attached and an IV running, and the particular mechanical intimacy of a person whose body is being managed by external systems because the internal ones temporarily cannot be trusted to manage themselves. His face had the slack, absent quality of deep sedation, and his colour had improved from what it had been in Trey's apartment. The grey-blue that Torres had seen at first assessment now replaced by something closer to human. Carol sat in the chair next to the bed and looked at her son and did not cry immediately. She had cried in the car, briefly and completely, and now she was past that phase and into the phase that comes after. The long, quiet, wakeful phase of someone who has arrived at the place they were afraid of arriving and is now simply present in it, attending, holding the room with their attention, as though attention itself is a form of intervention. The attending physician told her that Ryan had been very close. He used the clinical phrasing that physicians use, which is precise and technical, and in its precision somehow more frightening than plain language would have been. He said the next 12 hours were important. He said the team would monitor closely. He said she should try to rest. She did not rest. She sat in the chair. She watched the monitors. She tracked the breathing. The real breathing now, not the assisted version. Ryan's lungs having resumed independent operation sometime around 1 a.m. in the way that bodies resume things when the immediate threat is managed and the chemistry begins to clear. At 3 a.m. Ryan's hand moved. Not purposefully, just the random motor event of a brain beginning to resurface. But Carol saw it, and she put her hand over his, and she stayed exactly where she was. Outside the hospital, Columbus continued its November night. The highways lit and largely empty. The Ohio sky the particular flat black of a Midwest winter without stars. The city going about its unconscious 3 a.m. business, with no awareness of what had just been decided in one of its ECU rooms. One of its thousands of people had been 11 minutes from a different outcome. The city didn't know. The city never knows. It just continues, indifferent and ongoing, while inside its lit buildings the specific human arithmetic of survival and loss resolves itself one case at a time, quietly, without ceremony, with no guarantee about the next calculation. Ryan woke up not knowing what year it was. This is not a metaphor. He surfaced from the sedation sometime around noon on the 15th of November, opened his eyes to the ICU ceiling, and when a nurse asked him simple orientation questions, "What year is it? What city are you in? What is your name?" he answered 2 out of 3 correctly and stared at the ceiling for a full 30 seconds before producing the year. The brain, deprived of adequate oxygen, and then flooded with reversal agents and then left to clear a catastrophic chemical load overnight, does not wake up fully assembled. It comes back in pieces, like a city restoring power after a blackout, some districts first, others later, some flickering before they hold. Carol was in the chair. She had been in the chair for 13 hours. Ryan looked at her, and whatever the sedation had left of his emotional capacity in that first waking hour was enough to understand what her face meant. Not just the relief, but the cost of the relief, the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent a night not knowing which side of a line the person they love would end up on. He didn't speak. She squeezed his hand. The monitors beeped with the indifferent regularity of machines that don't understand what they're measuring. The medical withdrawal process began that afternoon, and it was nothing like what television suggests when it depicts detox. There was no dramatic sweating and screaming, no cinematic crisis. What there was instead was a protocol, careful, slow, and deliberately unglamorous. The hospital's approach to benzodiazepine withdrawal was a supervised tapering schedule using diazepam, a longer-acting benzodiazepine with a more predictable pharmacological profile than alprazolam. The logic was counterintuitive but medically sound. You treat benzo dependency with a benzo, then reduce the benzo incrementally over days and weeks, giving the GABA system time to begin rebuilding its own infrastructure, rather than having it pulled out from under it all at once. The process was slow by design. Ryan's dosage was reduced by approximately 10% every few days, a pace calibrated to keep him below the seizure threshold while still making progress. The medical team monitored his vitals constantly in the first 72 hours, because the window immediately following acute overdose and the beginning of supervised withdrawal is the window in which the nervous system is most likely to produce unexpected responses. Ryan experienced those responses, not seizures. The protocol prevented that. But the space between the chemical sedation he'd been living inside for 8 months and the functional sobriety that was the destination was not empty. It was full of everything the pills had been suppressing, now surfacing without the mute button. Anxiety returned first, and it was not the anxiety Ryan had experienced before March. The panic attack that had started this entire sequence, the one at the logistics company desk, the tight chest and cold hands and racing heart, had been real but manageable in retrospect. What arrived in the hospital bed on the second day was categorically different. His nervous system, stripped of 8 months of chemical sedation and not yet capable of producing adequate natural inhibition, ran at a frequency that had no analogue in his previous experience. The clinical term is rebound anxiety, the GABA system, suppressed for so long, overcorrecting toward hyperactivity upon reduction of the suppressing agent. In plain language, the drug that had been prescribed to treat anxiety created, upon withdrawal, anxiety so severe it bore no resemblance to the original condition. It was physical, Not just racing thoughts, but a full-body electrical wrongness, a skin-crawling hyper-arousal that made lying still in a hospital bed feel like a physical impossibility. Ryan spent the second night gripping the bed rails not because he was in pain, but because the sensation of stillness had become intolerable, and movement was the only thing that partially addressed it. The nurses adjusted his taper rate slightly. The protocol bent toward him, rather than requiring him to bend toward it. This was the difference between medically supervised withdrawal and what Ryan had attempted alone in his bathroom in October. The presence of people with the knowledge and authority to respond to what his body was doing in real time with tools he hadn't had access to. It helped. Not enough to make the process comfortable, but enough to make it survivable. The insomnia arrived on day 3 and stayed for weeks. Sleep, which the benzodiazepines had been manufacturing artificially for months, did not return simply because Ryan was no longer flooding his system with suppressants. The brain's natural sleep architecture, the cycling through REM and deep sleep stages that genuine rest requires, had been disrupted for so long that it no longer initiated reliably on its own. Ryan lay in the hospital bed through the 3rd and 4th nights largely awake, drifting occasionally into shallow, unsatisfying half-sleep that left him more exhausted than wakefulness would have. The sleep deprivation compounded every other symptom. The anxiety felt sharper without rest. The cognitive fog, already significant from the overdose and the months of heavy sedation, thickened. Ryan had difficulty tracking conversations, difficulty holding onto the thread of his own thoughts for more than a minute at a time. He would begin a thought and lose it before it resolved, the way you lose a word you know perfectly well by thinking too hard about it. The neurologist who assessed him on day 4 was direct in the specific way that neurologists are direct. Not cruel, but unwilling to soften facts into shapes that would be more comfortable to receive. The cognitive effects of prolonged high-dose benzodiazepine use and acute overdose were real and measurable. Some would resolve with time, some might not resolve completely. The brain had plasticity. It could relearn, rebuild, reorganize, but it did this work on its own schedule, and the schedule was not something anyone could accelerate through will or optimism. Ryan absorbed this information in the fragmented way he absorbed everything in those first days, partially with gaps, the meaning assembling slowly in the hours after the conversation rather than during it. Carol had not left the hospital for the first 48 hours. Dennis had brought her a change of clothes, had sat with her through the second day, had gone home to sleep and returned the following morning. The logistics of their presence were managed with the quiet efficiency of parents who have found themselves in a crisis and organised around it, because organisation is the only form of control available. Carol had called the non-profit rehabilitation program on the morning of the 15th, while Ryan was still unconscious, and explained the situation to the intake coordinator. The slot, Ryan's slot, the one she'd spent 11 days and 43 phone calls securing, was at risk. Residential programs operate on firm timelines. A patient in an ICU cannot fulfill an intake date. The intake coordinator, a woman named Diane who had been working in addiction services for 14 years, told Carol something that Carol would remember for the rest of her life. She said that what had happened to Ryan, the overdose, the hospitalization, was not a disqualifying event. It was a qualifying event. It was exactly the kind of acute crisis that demonstrated the level of need the program existed to address. She would hold the slot. She would adjust the intake timeline to accommodate Ryan's medical discharge. She would make it work. Carol thanked her and then sat quietly for a moment in the hospital hallway, with the phone in her hand doing the specific emotional arithmetic of someone who has just received good news while still fully inside bad news, trying to locate the feeling that corresponds to that particular combination. Ryan's medical discharge came on the 8th day. Not fully tapered, The diazepam reduction would continue on an outpatient basis through the rehabilitation program, which had the medical staff to manage it. He was discharged lighter than he had entered, in a specific way that had nothing to do with weight. 8 days of institutional clarity, no street supply, no alcohol, no chemical noise beyond the controlled taper medication, had returned something to his face that Carol recognized but couldn't name precisely. Not health. Something earlier than health. The face of someone who is present in the room, even if being present is uncomfortable. He walked out of the hospital on a grey November morning, 8 days after the night at Trey's apartment. Carol had brought his coat. He put it on in the lobby, and they walked to the parking garage without speaking, and Carol drove, and Ryan sat in the passenger seat and watched Columbus pass the windows with the careful attention of someone re-encountering a familiar thing from a new angle. The rehabilitation facility was 40 minutes north. Carol had packed a bag for him. She'd done it herself, gone to his apartment with a key he'd given her months ago, moved through the rooms that held the evidence of 8 months without touching anything that didn't go into the bag. Clothes. A book he'd mentioned once that she'd found on his shelf. A photograph from before. The facility was not what either of them had imagined, which meant it matched neither their fears nor their hopes. It was a converted Victorian house in a residential neighbourhood. 3 stories, 12 beds, a common room with mismatched furniture, and a coffee maker that ran continuously. A small garden in the back that nobody was using in November. The staff consisted of a medical director, 2 counsellors, a nurse who managed the taper medications, and an assortment of people in various stages of their own recovery who had transitioned into support roles. It was underfunded in ways that were visible in the furniture and the lighting fixtures and the thickness of the towels. It was staffed by people doing meaningful work with inadequate resources and enough personal investment to compensate imperfectly for the gap. Ryan's intake process took 2 hours. Forms, assessments, a conversation with the medical director about the diazepam taper schedule, an orientation to the rules and the routine. The rules were not punitive, they were structural. Meals at specific times, group sessions twice daily, individual counselling 3 times per week, no phones after 9, no outside contact for the first 5 days, a boundary that Carol had been warned about and accepted with the specific discipline of someone who understands that the boundary exists for a reason, even when the reason is hard to inhabit. Ryan was shown to his room, small, clean, a single window overlooking the November garden. He sat on the bed for a moment after the staff member left, in the particular stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long and damaging journey, and is not yet sure what to do with the arrival. His hands were not shaking. That was something. His brain was still misfiring in a dozen small ways. Thoughts arriving incomplete, sleep refusing to organize itself, anxiety spiking without external provocation, at intervals he couldn't predict. But his hands were not shaking, and the room was quiet, and the taper medication was being managed by a nurse who knew what she was doing, and somewhere in the arithmetic of those facts was the beginning of something that wasn't recovery yet, but was the precondition for it. The first week at the facility was the hardest week Ryan had experienced without chemical assistance to blunt the edges of it. Group sessions required him to sit in a room with 11 other people and listen to versions of his own story told in different voices. Different drugs, different cities, different entry points, the same biological trap. The sameness was not comforting. It was disorienting in the way that mirrors are disorienting when you're not expecting them. Ryan had spent 8 months constructing a private architecture around his dependency, the logic that made it specific to him, manageable by him, different from the thing it actually was. The group dismantled that architecture not aggressively, but through accumulation, through the simple effect of 11 people telling the truth out loud in the same room until the truth became the dominant acoustic. He didn't talk in the first 3 sessions. He listened, which the counsellors recognised as its own form of participation. The individual counselling was different, smaller, more specific, less protected by the group dynamic that allows a person to sit quietly at the edge. His counsellor was a man named Victor, mid-40s, who had the quality of someone who had heard every version of every story and remained genuinely interested in each one. Victor did not challenge Ryan's account of his own history so much as he expanded it, asked questions that revealed the architecture of the habit from angles Ryan hadn't examined, identified the connective tissue between the panic attack in March and the night at Trey's apartment and everything in between. The connections were not comforting to see clearly, but seeing them clearly was different from not seeing them, and different in this context was the direction of progress. The taper continued. The diazepam reduced in increments calibrated to Ryan's response. Some reductions produced 2 bad days, some produced 4. The anxiety continued to spike unpredictably. The sleep remained fractured and insufficient. His memory was still unreliable in ways that embarrassed him during group sessions, when he would lose the thread of something he'd said a moment before and have to ask someone to tell him where he'd been. But by the end of the 2nd week, something had shifted in a register too small to call progress but too real to dismiss. The spikes were slightly less frequent. The gaps in sleep were slightly shorter. Ryan began to talk in group, briefly, carefully, in the tentative register of someone testing whether the floor will hold. It held. Not because the floor was solid. It wasn't yet. Because people in the room had been there before him and were still standing, which is a form of evidence that doesn't require language to transmit. 2 years is not a long time, it's long enough. By November of 2015, Ryan Calloway was 26 years old, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of Columbus, working part-time at a hardware store while completing an online certification in substance abuse counselling. The apartment was small and deliberately sparse, not from poverty, though money was still tight, but from a conscious decision he'd made sometime during his 2nd month of recovery that the accumulation of things felt dangerous in a way he couldn't fully articulate but trusted completely. He looked different. Not in the gaunt, hollowed-out way he'd looked in November 2013, when Carol had stood in his doorway and seen the bill the body was presenting. Different in a harder direction. The specific physical solidity of someone who has been through something structural and come out with more density than they went in with. He had gained the weight back and then some. His hands were steady. He slept. Not perfectly, but genuinely. The real sleep of a brain that had slowly, imperfectly, rebuilt enough of its own infrastructure to function without chemical assistance. The cognitive effects had not fully resolved. This was the part nobody had warned him about with adequate emphasis, and its persistence was the detail that had required the most sustained adjustment. Memory remained the most visible damage 2 years out. Not the dramatic amnesia of the blackout periods. Those had ended with the dependency. What remained was subtler and more permanent feeling, a processing speed that was measurably slower than his pre-2013 baseline, a working memory that occasionally dropped information it should have held, a difficulty with sustained concentration that required management strategies rather than resolving on its own. Victor, his counsellor at the facility, had told him during their final sessions that the research on long-term cognitive effects of heavy benzodiazepine use was still developing, that some people recovered fully, some recovered partially, and that the honest answer about which category Ryan would fall into was that nobody knew yet. 2 years later, Ryan had assembled his own answer from lived evidence, partial. He had recovered enough to function, to learn, to build. He had not recovered to the baseline he'd had before March of 2013. The sharp quickness that had made teachers notice him, that restless intellectual speed that had never quite found its direction, was not entirely there. What was there instead was something slower, but more deliberate, less brilliant, but more reliable. He had made a private, mostly peaceful accommodation with the difference. Mostly, not always. There were days when the gap between who he remembered being and who he was now had a specific weight, and he carried it and moved through the day anyway. The rehabilitation program had ended after 21 days technically, but the real work had continued in the structure that followed discharge. Victor had connected him with an outpatient group that met 3 times a week at a community centre on the west side. Ryan had attended for 8 months, initially because the structure felt necessary, and later because the room had become something he didn't want to leave. Not out of dependence, but out of the specific loyalty that forms between people who have sat in the same circle, telling difficult truths for long enough that the truths become shared property. He had relapsed once, in February of 2014, 3 months after discharge. Not dramatically. Not a return to the Altoids tin and the street supply and the daily pharmaceutical architecture. 1 bar, obtained from someone at a gathering he had attended despite knowing he shouldn't have, taken during a week when the anxiety had spiked to a level that his rebuilt coping mechanisms hadn't been able to contain. He took it, felt the familiar chemical relief for 3 hours, and then sat with what he'd done for the rest of the night in the specific clarity that follows a relapse. The clarity of someone who has just handed themselves evidence about the distance they still have to travel. He told Victor the following morning. He told the group that week. The relapse was absorbed into his recovery narrative not as a failure that negated the previous 3 months, but as a data point that informed the next decision, which was to increase his outpatient sessions temporarily and to stop attending social gatherings that contained his previous supply network. Simple adjustments, painful to make, made anyway. He had not used since February 2014, 21 months of consecutive sobriety by November 2015, which in the recovery community is a number people mark and acknowledge, and which Ryan marked privately without ceremony, because ceremony felt like it belonged to a future version of himself he hadn't fully become yet. The people in his orbit had different endings, and the differences were not distributed according to any logic that felt just. Kayla Simmons, the 17-year-old from Westerville, who had taken her first bar at a house party in September 2013, had completed her outpatient program by March of 2014, and, as of 2015, was a freshman at Ohio University studying social work. Her 3 months of dependency had been real and damaging and, relative to what it could have been, survivable. Youth and short duration and early detection had worked in her favour. She was one of the cases that the system, stumbling and underfunded as it was, had managed to catch before the fall became unsurvivable. She still had bad weeks. She had learned to identify them early and respond before they accumulated into something larger. That skill, recognizing the early signature of a crisis before it becomes a crisis, is not something most 20-year-olds have. Kayla had it because she'd paid for it in a currency nobody would have chosen. Gerald Marsh, the veteran from South Columbus, had a harder road and a more complicated destination. His VA appointment in February 2014 had finally connected him with a PTSD specialist who understood both the trauma and the dependency and treated them as the related conditions they were, rather than addressing them sequentially in a way that left one always undermining the other. The benzodiazepine taper had taken 4 months under medical supervision. The trauma therapy had taken longer, was still ongoing in 2015, probably would continue for years because PTSD at the level Gerald carried it doesn't resolve on a treatment schedule. It gets managed, it gets integrated, it stops running the show mostly on good days. His son was 17 in 2015. He played baseball. Gerald attended every game he could, sitting in the aluminum bleachers in his jacket with a coffee, watching his son field grounders with the focused attention of a father who understands that presence is not a given, who's been on the kitchen floor and come back from it, who knows that the specific gift of being alive for ordinary moments is not ordinary at all. Sandra Kowalski had lost her nursing license and not recovered it by 2015. The state nursing board's reinstatement process required documented sobriety, letters of recommendation, a supervised practice period, and a review board that moved at the speed of institutional caution. Sandra had met all the requirements by early 2015 and was waiting for the board's decision. She had found work in medical billing, adjacent to the healthcare world she'd spent 20 years in, close enough to feel the distance from it clearly. The dependency had been treated. The professional consequences were still being served, because the legal and regulatory machinery doesn't taper on the same schedule as the human nervous system. She was sober. She was diminished in specific and unfair ways. Both things were true simultaneously, and she had found a way to carry them both without letting one cancel the other. Darnell had stopped dealing entirely by the spring of 2014. The proximate cause was a conversation with a detective who visited him in a way that wasn't an arrest, but carried the clear subtext that an arrest was available if the current situation continued. The deeper cause was the counterfeit batch. When he learned, weeks after the fact, that the pills he had supplied to Ryan the week before the overdose had come from the contaminated Cincinnati source, something happened in him that his prior years of rationalizing the trade hadn't produced. He had known, abstractly, that what he sold was dangerous. He had not known, concretely, that he had handed a man pills that were chemically misrepresented, and watched that man nearly die from the compounded result. He was not responsible for the overdose. The causal chain was too complex and too distributed for simple assignment of blame. But responsibility and culpability are not the same category, and Darnell understood the difference. He stopped dealing. He went back to the auto parts store full-time. He eventually enrolled in a community college program he'd been deferring for 3 years. This was not redemption in the cinematic sense. It was a person adjusting their behavior based on evidence, which is the unglamorous real version of change. The systemic shift that Ryan had been part of, without knowing it, without choosing it, was beginning to appear in public discourse by 2015, though it was moving with the characteristic slowness of institutional self-correction. The FDA had issued updated prescribing guidelines for benzodiazepines in 2016, strengthening the warnings about dependency and the risks of co-prescribing with opioids. State prescription drug monitoring programs, databases that tracked controlled substance prescriptions across providers, making it harder for patients to obtain multiple prescriptions from multiple doctors, were being implemented across Ohio and other states. The medical community was beginning to publish, with increasing frankness, self-examination about the prescribing culture that had normalized benzodiazepines as a routine response to anxiety at a population scale. None of this happened fast. None of it happened fast enough. The 94 million annual prescriptions of 2013 didn't drop to 40 million by 2015. The culture of prescription doesn't reverse in 2 years, and the patients already dependent on the medications don't stop needing them simply because the guidelines update. What changed was the awareness at the edges, the medical students being trained differently, the prescribers asking follow-up questions they hadn't been asking, the emergency rooms developing better protocols for benzo overdose, the public health vocabulary slowly acquiring language for a crisis it had been experiencing without naming. It was progress of the slow, structural, uncinematic variety that doesn't make satisfying news, but occasionally prevents the next Ryan Calloway from having to learn everything the hard way. Ryan thought about March of 2013 sometimes with the specificity that surprised him. Not the overdose, not the ICU, but the parking lot of the walk-in clinic, the first pill dissolving, the 40 minutes of ordinary time before the world changed. He thought about how reasonable it had all seemed, how the prescription was legal, and the doctor was competent, and the panic attack was real, and the relief was genuine, and every individual step in the sequence had its own internal logic that made it feel like a reasonable response to a real problem. The catastrophe hadn't announced itself. It had assembled itself from reasonable components in a sequence that only looked inevitable from the far end. This was the thing he tried to communicate in his counselling certification coursework, in the community centre group sessions he had started co-facilitating by mid-2015, in the conversations he had with the people who came through those doors with the same blankness and the same rationalizations and the same genuine belief that their situation was specific to them and therefore manageable by them alone. He didn't tell his own story as a cautionary tale, because cautionary tales have a self-congratulatory distance from their subject that he didn't feel entitled to. He told it as evidence that the sequence was predictable, that the system had known failure points, that the dependency was biological rather than moral, that the people who made it through were not stronger or more deserving than the people who didn't, only differently positioned relative to the resources and the timing and the particular luck of who called 911 instead of waiting. He told it because Trey had made the call, and Torres had been 8 years experienced, and Carol had stayed in the chair, and Diane at the non-profit had held the slot, and Victor had asked the right questions, and the confluence of those factors had been narrow enough that he felt the narrowness every day in a way that precluded comfort but produced something else, a sustained, unflashy, practical gratitude that expressed itself mostly as showing up, to the job, to the group, to the certification classes, to the Sunday phone calls with Carol, which had continued without interruption, same time as always, 11 a.m. Her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who picks up the phone each week with the same private relief that there is someone to call. The Altoids tin was gone. He didn't remember throwing it away and didn't need to. The apartment was quiet in the early mornings, before the hardware store shift, in the specific good quiet of a space that belongs to someone who has decided what they need and removed what they don't. Ryan made coffee. He sat at the small table by the window. Columbus outside was November again. Bare trees, flat sky, the city moving through its ordinary morning with the indifferent continuity of cities. He was alive. He was present in the room. His hands were wrapped around a mug, and his brain was slow in the mornings, and his memory still had gaps that required workarounds, and his sleep was better than it had been, but not what it had been before any of this started. He was alive. That sentence doesn't end with a period. It ends with the weight of everything it took to remain true, and the lightness, genuine, hard-won, impermanent, and real, of still being the person saying it.